Now, what I find most reprehensible about this whole charade is that we have seen this act before, and it failed spectacularly in its first run in the late 60s and early 70s. At least the London Gold Pool, which was in effect at that time, was a considerably more open attempt to hold the gold price in the neighborhood of $35 and maintain the fiction that the US dollar was as good as gold. However, it was overcome by the reality of a large US budget deficit driven by the attempts to conduct the Vietnam War while financing the Great Society, an explosion in oil prices, which ultimately took the price from under $3 to $40, and rampant inflation throughout the system. The value of paper currency came into question, and gold rose from $35 to roughly $800 per ounce in less than a decade. It wasn't corralled until Paul Volcker took over the reins of the US Fed and, using draconian methods, squeezed the inflation out of the US system for a very short period of time. Now here we are, 25 years after the previous peak, and they're at it again, aggressively suppressing the gold price in an attempt to protect the world's totally fiat monetary system. I'm not sure what is more pathetic at this point: the renewed attempt by the powers to be to control the gold price in the face of their previous failure, or the investing public's blithe disregard of history and acceptance of the current status quo. I really think that the current gold suppression scheme looks like an act of desperation, which will soon be overrun.
But these truths are just part of a much larger, more monstrous truth, which is that the rig is run to prop up a monetary system that is immoral and in conflict with the foundational law of the United States. And here's where it gets tricky. The rig is just a means to an end, but it is a vital and an indispensable means to that end. The deeper you dig, the more vital it seems to be. Our monetary system is, after all, just a confidence game. If people lose confidence in the dollar, the system doesn't so much collapse as evaporate. There is no better way to undermine confidence in government's funny money than to let real money run free.
Annual gold demand is 1,500 tons above production. The gap is being filled and the price held down by central bank dishoarding. The central banks are accounting for their remaining gold reserves deceptively.
The reason the price of gold is hundreds of dollars per ounce below where it should be is because the gold cartel has clandestinely lent out more than 16,000 tons of gold from the coffers of the central banks to keep the price from rising. This means the central banks has less than half the gold they say they have in their vaults.
Not only are central banks guilty of disinformation, deception is one of their most frequently used tools. The history of banking is replete with examples that are not just a lack of disclosure, but rather outright deception. To give just but one example, look today how they account for gold loans. They carry gold in the vault and gold out on loan as one line item. In effect, they are saying they are above generally accepted accounting principles and that they can as a result report cash and accounts receivables as one and the same thing. Accounting like that would make even the people at Enron blush.
Key in my mind is the fact that a considerable amount of the central bank gold has already been mobilized over the past 10 years in the carry trade business and the ongoing price suppression scheme, and since it cannot be sold a second time, this fact will become the major determinant in the direction of gold prices in the not too distant future. These guys are running out.
They cannot get this gold back. They say they've lent it. When you lend something out, you expect to get it back if you're lending it. They can't get it back because at this point in time, demand is more than 1,500 tons greater than supply. The only reason the price isn't going crazy now is because they're surreptitiously taking the central bank gold, giving it to the bullion dealers, and the bullion dealers are putting supply into the market. Once that supply is gone, the price has to go bananas.
The central banks have a very serious problem, and that problem is the physical market. the Middle Easterners are buying gold at an extraordinary pace. What this essentially means is that the central banks have a tiger by the ears, because these people out there will not be satisfied with by anything except physical. It is simply a question of when they run out.
I mean, demand is clearly on the rise for any number of reasons, but the greatest aspect of it is the monetary nature. I mean, people are beginning to see gold as an alternative to paper currency, so demand for investment purposes is rising. But this is starting from a situation where the demand for gold generally, for the more conventional uses, jewelry, industrial demand, small bar hoarding in the East, was well ahead of sort of mine supply. So I see, because of investment demand, the demand for gold rising fairly significantly in the upcoming years. At the same time, that there is no way in the next 3 or 4 years gold mine supply is going to do anything but decline. It's currently somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,500 tons. It should decline closer to 2,000 tons. And there's nothing you can do about it, because it's basically baked in the cake, essentially, because there hasn't been enough exploration and there's not a lot of new projects ready to go, and it takes a long time today with the permitting issues and everything else to get a new mine into production. So production from the ground is not going up, and if demand rises like I think, you've got an interesting sort of supply-demand equation.
The cheering thing is, they got into this thinking that they could sell 100, 200 tons a year for the next 100 years and then worry about it. It turns out, in fact, they're having to ship out, who knows, 5, 8, 10% of their remaining stock, perhaps even more, in physical form, plus what they're having to sell in the option market to deal with the occasional forays of the hedge funds. So it's later in the day than everybody thinks. Thank you.
Let me enumerate just a few of the reasons why the situation for gold enthusiasts is better this time than it was in the 70s. I mean, first and foremost, and we've talked about this before, the central banks have parted with a far greater quantity of their gold this time than they did the last time, and far more than is generally known. And they've obscured that fact with the bogus accounting endorsed by the IMF. I mean, receivables are not distinguished from gold. This was talked about earlier, but I mean, I think it's really significant that the receivables are not distinguished from gold held in the vault, thereby it's obscuring how much metal has already been dumped into the market. And the second great point is that there are a number of new influential players on the central bank scene who are not under the hegemony of the U.S. However, the central banks today, I mean, the Far East, China, Russia, etc., they've been accumulating remarkably huge reserves, primarily U.S. dollar denominated. And at some point, I believe they will be delighted to relieve the Western central banks of whatever further gold they feel that they may wish to dispose of. And then lastly, there is infinitely more paper this time around, depreciating crappy paper money in comparison to the outstanding gold stock than there was in the 70s. So thus, I would say that despite immense frustration on the part of the gold enthusiasts at this time, and I've certainly fallen into that camp, the people with the real problem are the bears. The fact that this is also abundantly clear to me, as I'm clear as it is to many of you in this room, at a time when the vast majority of society could absolutely care less about the subject, is perhaps the most bullish aspect of all.
The reluctance of central bankers around the world to think of gold or silver as money is going to be overcome. There's going to be a change in attitude when the frightening, terrifying disaster finally strikes upon us. Then there is going to be a change of mind, and that is when I think that this idea of how to introduce silver and gold too into circulation in parallel with paper will become attractive